to extend this invitation to you today. And you hit record, so perfect. Thank you, Katie, for helping us with that. So every year for the past 3 years, we've welcomed the broader community into our classroom to join this course called Natural Resource Rights and Reconciliation here in the department. And it's an opportunity for us to learn firsthand from practitioners who are actively stewarding Indigenous knowledges and who are maintaining those values and practices that are necessary for applying those knowledges in this field. And so today we're especially honored for this gift of welcoming Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson into our classroom today, who's going to share her understandings of Indigenous fire stewardship in Canada with us. And Dr. Christianson is a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service and currently serving as an Indigenous fire specialist in the National Fire Management Division. She is Métis from Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta and works in collaboration with Indigenous Nations across Canada on fire stewardship practices such as cultural burning or good fire, efforts for decolonizing land management, support for Indigenous wildland firefighters, and contributes to the study of wildfire evacuations. And she also shares her experience and guidance internationally, as well being a board member for the International Association of Wildland Fire and the International Research Advisory Panel for Natural Hazards Research Australia. Sorry, I've got two folks. I've got the camera here and then the classroom, so I'll be back and forth a little bit. And then somehow on top of this and being a mom and doing all of this great work, she also has found time and energy to co-author some great books and resources, including First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, a guide for communities and external agencies, and Blazing the Trail, celebrating Indigenous fire stewardship, and also recently the We Are Fire Toolkit for applying Indigenous-led fire practices and Western fire management in the Saskatchewan River Delta. And last but not least, Amy co-hosts the Good Fire podcast. And I've been a longtime fangirl of you and of this podcast. And for this and really all your efforts too, I just want to share my personal thanks. You know, as an Indigenous scholar, as an educator in this field, I just find so much inspiration and grounding in the work that you do. And you and your collaborators, the resources that you have created are so critically needed in this field and so helpful. And I love how it's just beautiful seeing students light up when they learn from you and they learn from these international exchanges and conversations about good fire through the podcast too. So you all, how did you all feel about the podcast? We've got like a lot of new fans now in the classroom and in the other classes I teach too. So I just wanted to share my personal appreciation with Dr. Cardinal Christianson for joining. And as you listen in, as all of you listen in on her talk today, we've shared a Google Jamboard in the Zoom chat. We'll be dropping that in as people join. It's a virtual space where you can share any questions or comments that you have for her during the talk that we can return to towards the end with however much time you want for discussion and questions. And with that, I hope I've properly hyped everyone up for this talk today. And with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn this canoe over to you. And yeah, just really excited, really grateful to have you join us today.
Thanks, Dominique, and thanks so much for that intro. And I'm as well a huge fan of your work. And so when I got the request from you to come speak, I was like, I have to make it work to just come and meet you. I wish I could be there in person, but yeah, thanks for accommodating my schedule. I have 2 young kids and it's really quite difficult for me to travel at the moment too much. So yeah, I'll just kick off here by sharing my screen. Hopefully it'll work, and you can just let me know if there's an issue there. Just interrupt me.
Looks good so far.
Can you see that? Am I in presentation mode?
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I won't go through this too much again, my background, but I'm currently seconded or interchanged to Parks Canada. And so it's been a really nice opportunity for me to take some of my research work and go to a much more operational organization. So yeah, I'm just gonna talk today. I just first wanted to give an overview of some of the terminology that I use. So I'll kind of go back and forth between Indigenous people, and sometimes I'll also point out First Nations. So in Canada, Indigenous peoples are made up of 3 distinct groups. So one is First Nations, and there's over 700 First Nations in Canada. The second group of Indigenous peoples in Canada is Métis, of which I'm a part of that nation, and then the Inuit. So just so you know, for context, sometimes I kind of bounce back and forth, but I'll try not to too much, because many of the statistics that we have are specifically related to First Nations people in Canada because they live on reserve. So just to ground a little bit, I just wanted, like in Canada, you know, we're doing land acknowledgements all the time, but I find they're getting a bit superficial. So I just, especially virtually, it's difficult. So I just wanted to acknowledge the territory that you all are on, and then tell you a little bit about my territory. So as Dominique said in the intro, I'm from Treaty 8, which is northern Alberta, is where I was born and raised. And so my family is the Cardinal and Labakan families from northern Alberta. And so the Cardinal side of my family was from Pieces Band 127. And so they were disenfranchised, so basically removed from their First Nation status after there was a real rebellion in Canada, which was like kind of an uprising of Indigenous folks against the Canadian government. And then that's it. That part of my family is from Lac La Biche. And then the other part of my family is the Labakan family. And so they're actually from Treaty 6. And so they eventually migrated up northern to Treaty 8 territory. And so it's kind of a bit interesting for me because now I'm back living in Treaty 6 territory, which is kind of where 2 parts of my family were from. And my family was part of a band that were the initial signatories onto Treaty 6. And so for me, bringing fire back is not just, you know, something I do for my job, but a personal obligation I feel to my family and to myself to like uphold treaty in Canada. And that's, you know, that care for the land. So I was just going to talk quickly about fire evacuations to really, it's part of the research that I do, but it's really also to place the disproportionate risk that Indigenous people face. So a map of Canada here. The gray dots are evacuations. The orange dots are as well, but the orange dots are Indigenous communities in Canada that have been evacuated. And so the bigger the size of the dot is the bigger number of evacuees. So this is between 1980 and 2021 in Canada. And so this region here is the boreal forest region of Canada, and that's where most of our evacuations have occurred. But recently we've been having a lot of evacuations in the interior of British Columbia. And so you can see that really dense area here. But as you can see, there's lots of orange dots on this map. And so what's really important to point out is that about 4.9% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous. Even less people actually live on reserve. In Canada, I think it's 1.9% of the Canadian population. Yet 42% of evacuation events in Canada were of Indigenous communities. So it just really shows, again, that disproportionate risk that our nations face. And so here, this is a map. I don't know, you might not be able to read the text on it, but don't worry about it. It's just, again, a map showing evacuations. And what it's pointing out is communities that have been evacuated multiple times in that 42-year period for wildland fires. And so of all these nations that have been evacuated 5 or more times, almost all of them except for one is Indigenous community, primarily First Nation reserves. And so you can see that there's 4 communities that have been evacuated 7 times in that period just from wildland fire. And so not even from flooding, which is also a big risk that our nations face. So another interesting stat to look at is the cause of evacuation. So in Canada, most evacuations are from the direct threat of wildfire. So like when a fire is entering a community, or there's, you know, a risk of a flame front or embers that might burn a town down. But for communities with greater than 50% Indigenous population, yes, there's evacuations from the direct threat, but a huge proportion of evacuations are smoke evacuations. So where there's no fire near a community, but the air quality is just so poor that residents have to leave. And a big thing of that is because we have many nations that are fly-in only communities where they don't actually have road access. So as Dominic mentioned, we have this book that came out, and it's based off of research that was done by the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, where we interviewed over 200 First Nations people who'd been evacuated and looked at their evacuation experiences. And so the reason for this work was because there was a lot of emphasis on like what agencies were experiencing during evacuations, but no one was really talking to First Nations people. And we knew it was a disaster, basically, literally, that there were many issues that were happening during these evacuations. And so I just want to point out that, you know, the vulnerability that our nations experience in Canada is, you know, caused by colonization. And I always rant on this, like our communities were living very well adapted to some of these risks in the Canadian landscape. But, you know, the movement of people onto reserve, taking children away and putting them in residential school, that loss of Indigenous knowledge, the Indian Act in Canada has created more and more vulnerability. There's also issues with jurisdiction in Canada. So in Canada, First Nations are under federal jurisdiction, but emergency management and fire management are both under provincial jurisdiction. So when events like this happen, there's a lot of confusion almost every time about, you know, who's responsible for what when it comes to First Nations. There's low levels of preparedness in communities. And again, that's primarily related to this big issue with jurisdiction. There's a huge lack of trust in agencies and reluctance to evacuate by nations. Again, many of the evacuations are remote, so communities that need aircraft to fly out, and this often results in the separation of families. And we're not talking like families that just have to stay in different hotel rooms. We're talking about families spread hundreds of kilometers apart because their planes go to different host communities. And then again, there's the new issues on top of the old issues. So we have many communities with water quality issues. There's poverty, again, caused by colonization. And so, you know, it just compounds then when communities are faced as well with these extreme events. And for many First Nations, it's often thought of by external agencies, you know, once we get people home, then the issues are over. But we found with our study that wasn't it. Like 5 years later, communities were still experiencing major issues related to their wildfire evacuations. Some of those financial and some also, you know, mental, physical, other problems. So in Canada, we have an increasing risk, and the GIF that's going to play on the side, hopefully you can see it, is the Elephant Hill fire that happened in British Columbia. And this is just showing the expansion daily of that fire. And these are multiple Indigenous communities that were impacted by this fire. And so, as you all know, we're seeing with climate change, increasing risk of fire in Canada. Fire exclusion and fire suppression policies in Canada, as well as current forest management practices, have contributed to this increasing risk of wildfire to our nations. And then we have the expansion of the wildland urban interface kind of into these higher areas of risk. As well, 60% of First Nations in Canada reserves are located within or intersect like these kind of high areas of danger that we call the wildland human interface in Canada. So I just wanted to bring in, step back in time a little bit till we go, and then we're going to jump into kind of what's currently happening in Canada. But this is an image that was created by an artist with Robert Gray, who's a friend of mine, who's a fire ecologist. And it's really looking at, you know, what things were like before when we can visualize what the landscape looked like. So this scene shows kind of like, you know, an early landscape that, and burns that might have been done for berries. So Indigenous cultural burning in Canada has been done since time immemorial. And it's Indigenous fire knowledge that's not singular, but it's plural and deeply connected to place. And we talk about this in that paper that you all read. And so Indigenous nations in Canada hold significant knowledge about fire-driven landscapes. And the thing I think I rant about in the podcast a lot is, you know, yes, we've lost knowledge about fire, but there's so much that still exists. And so that's not an excuse to keep Indigenous people from burning. And so for us, fire is not just fire. It's an important cultural practice that connects us to our landscape. And it's many Indigenous people believe that it's a responsibility that was passed down to Creator or from creator to us to steward these landscapes. And fire is one of the ways we can do that. So Indigenous people in Canada sought to replace fires of chance with fires of choice. So, you know, there were lightning fires that happened on the landscape. You know, lightning's a really important relative for Indigenous people. You know, we have many legends of Thunderbird and the importance of lightning on the landscape. And we relied on those lightning, burned areas for resources. But what happened was, you know, we couldn't control where those happened, when those happened. And oftentimes when they happened, they brought higher risk with them, right? Because it's like that hot, dry summer months when we would usually get those lightning fires. So those fires of choice are, you know, when we're choosing when and where to burn and using like people to put fire there. And so for Indigenous people, you know, it's using fire to achieve specific cultural objectives. So one quote that I really like from a study that Dr. Ferguson did in Northern Alberta is that I didn't set the forest on fire just for the sake of burning, but so that I could return to hunt the next year and live. And so the picture on the left is a picture of Indigenous people. We think it's probably the Blackfoot Nation, but we don't have, like, the archives didn't record what nation, but demonstrating a prairie fire start from about 1903. And then on the right is a picture of some burning that went on in the winter for muskrats with the Cumberland House Métis, which is in northern Saskatchewan. So Indigenous knowledge systems, and I'm sure, Dominique, I know you've talked about this in your class, have been shown to steward biodiversity. And there's some recent articles there, if you're interested, that really kind of make that case, and that they provide nature-based solutions to climate change. And that's with, you know, when we burn when we want and where we want, we can change how much carbon basically is released into the atmosphere. And as well, these knowledge systems also provide Indigenous disaster risk reduction solutions, which is a new kind of, I think it's actually from the UN, it's kind of the year of Indigenous disaster risk reduction and trying to bring more attention to that. So in Canada, as you guys probably read in the paper, we went through this period of cultural severance, and I really love that term. It was introduced to me by Dr. Mula. And so this is, like I said before, where in Canada, Indigenous people were removed from their territories, put on reserves. The Indian Act was put in place. And one of the things with the Indian Act is that you couldn't leave your reserve without a pass. So it basically completely disconnected Indigenous people from their territory. As well, at that time, we had residential schools in Canada, which were, you know, a horrendous period of time in Canadian history. And so wildfire management agencies then, like forestry groups at that time, also started implementing fire exclusion or fire suppression policies. And so there was 3 key ways that was done. And Kristen Vignetta summarizes it beautifully in her article that's linked there. So discrediting Indigenous knowledge, that whole savage narrative that, you know, we didn't know what we were doing. The idea of downplaying. So, you know, Indigenous people couldn't have managed the landscape. You know, there's not enough of us. There's not people currently doing that work. And then the whole idea of erasure. So that terra nullius narrative that I know that you guys had talked about, that idea of, you know, that when European settlers came over here, it was empty land for the taking. And I think Nancy Turner really summarized it well, but she says that basically that the European settlers didn't know that the landscape that they were currently enjoying and they thought was natural or wild was actually Indigenous managed territories. So this is the paper. I'm not going to go too much into it because I think you've all read it for the course, but if you're just listening in and haven't, it's called Centering Indigenous Voices, the Role of Fire in the Boreal Forests of North America. And when I think the most important things I think from this article is Table 1, which is a compilation of species that have been known to have been managed with Indigenous burning practices in the boreal forest. And so there's over 36 species listed there. It's a bit interesting because for that article, we just use things that were previously published in the academic literature. So recognizing that we're obviously missing a ton of information, you know, that either hasn't been published before for good reason, you know, but nations might hold that knowledge. But for us, it was just a good thing to kind of compile all that knowledge so that sometimes when you have like lots of things in different places, but then when you bring it together into one paper that's summary, it really can kind of start to make more of an impact for people, because they can see, that we weren't only managing for one thing. These were complex landscapes that were being managed for multiple cultural objectives. And so again, these are some more of those graphics from pyrosketchology and Bob Gray. But it's just so on the top, this is what we would have seen, pre that fire exclusion period. So where on the Canadian landscape, you would have had like kind of small burns that occurred in places, but because of the regular occurrence of fire on the landscape, the fires, like even natural lightning caused fires, wouldn't spread as far because there were mosaics on the landscape. And so when we say mosaics, when you look at it, you can see like there's patches of older growth, but then you can also see like in areas you can see through through the canopy to the forest floor, you can see prairie, you can see meadows. Like it's when we go to the mountains now in Canada, we see these carpeted coniferous forests, so basically like with pine and spruce trees, and we think that that's beautiful or that that's natural, but really that's just a landscape that's prone to disturbances like fire or insects. And so the middle picture then is, starting to show the fire suppression era. So that was when, planes started to come, put out fire. There were rangers on the ground, firefighting. The firefighting industrial complex was started. And you can see everything kind of starting to grow in. So we're losing that mosaics on the landscape. And then in the bottom is, now when a fire starts, there's really nowhere to stop it, like no natural fire breaks. So they can run through the landscape. And again, we're getting fires starting when it's really periods of high risk. So, that heat dome that we had where it was plus 50, windy, low RH or low relative humidity, and fires can just run, and they're very scary, not only for people, but also for the firefighters who are put on the line to try and, stop them. And so on the right is a picture of like burning in for beaver habitat on the right there. And so we see this in the modern day, and so I'm not going to go, but this is in BC. So you can see the top photo, you can see through the forest floor in many places. You can see grass, you can see like some older growth stands there, but spacing of trees. And then the middle picture was taken in 2011, and that just shows that carpet of forest, that we kind of now think is beautiful or wild in Canada. And then, fires come. So a fire came to that area in 2015, and you can actually see that the fire is trying to go back to that initial state, that state of mosaic on the landscape. So in Canada, we really want to see this new reunion with fire. And so where Indigenous people are back leading in this area. And so one thing when I joined Parks Canada, the reason why I did was because I thought that they were really smart about how they were approaching cultural burning and prescribed fire. And so for me, they're two completely different practices, and sometimes they're really conflated by agencies. So cultural fire is Indigenous led around cultural objectives. It's Indigenous knowledge driven around the time to burn and techniques for burning. It's generally slow, cool burns. So an elder described it as fires that we can walk beside. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's high intensity fire, but again, depends on your objective. It's family centered, and there's a lot of controversy right now about the use of accelerants for cultural burning. So, if you use a drip torch on a cultural burn, is it actually a cultural burn? Because many elders say that we're then introducing foreign substances to the landscape. So prescribed fire is agency driven. The objectives are usually hazard reduction or ecological. It's production burning, so as much in as little time as possible. And that's all around, money and people on the ground. It varies in intensity, but for Parks Canada, a lot of our fires are crown fire replications, so stand replacing fires. It's paramilitary structures, so it generally follows the incident command system. And accelerants are used all the time, you know, helicopters, heli torches, ping pong balls. And so there's a really almost disconnect, I feel, between, you know, the landscape, our relatives, and prescribed fire. So in Parks Canada, within our National Fire Management Division, we're going to be forming an Indigenous Fire Circle. And the idea of this group is that, you know, it's going to advise the agency on our fire management policies and programs, and focusing on 4 specific areas. So Indigenous engagement, Indigenous-led cultural burning, Indigenous fire guardian projects, and Parks Canada approaches to fire management, including improving cultural safety of wildland firefighters. And so this is just a video of a burn that was done in Waterton Lakes National Park. And so what you're seeing here is basically a backing fire moving very slow across the landscape, and it's unveiling a Blackfoot Confederacy marker. And so this is a very important ceremonial site for the Blackfoot Nation. It's where the beaver bundle was shared. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, you know, it shows that fire can like uncover things that exist on the landscape as well. And so, as we said, this is an important site that needs to be properly maintained. And so in Waterton, they've really been working hard to form partnerships with the nations there to reintroduce cultural fire. So another product that we produced was with Fire Smart Canada, which is basically very similar to the FireWise program in the States. And it's what we shorthandedly call the Indigenous Fire Smart booklet, but it's called Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship. And in there, it talks about, you know, that whole idea of good fire, bad fire. It has, I think, 11 or 12 different case studies of communities that are using fire in some way and reducing their fire risk. Some of that is by having their own fire crews, by using fire on the landscape. So yeah, I think it's it was really a difficult book to do because it was a collaborative writing team. So there was over 12 Indigenous authors. We had, I think, 8 Indigenous artists. We had an Indigenous graphic designer, 12 Indigenous peer reviewers. So it was a huge writing team that went into it. And if you're interested, you can order it off the Fire Smart Canada website. And so again, don't worry about the text on this page. I just mostly wanted to show that there's movements going on in Canada to revitalize cultural burning practices. And so this is a project that I'm part of with First Nations Emergency Services Society. And it was done with the Nestetine Nation. And looking at, you know, they went and interviewed their elders about fire, you know, how they use fire on the land. They had got key findings of different things like why they burn, important reasons for burning, and then key concerns that the nations had about climate change and adaptation. And then they developed next steps on things that they can do moving forward. And so a big part of this work is around like OCAP, we call in Canada, so ownership, control, access, and possession of data. Many nations don't want to share their fire knowledge with agencies. And so it's really a fine, you know, balancing act. And what we've been doing is just doing these interviews and stuff to inform community archives. So the community keeps all of the information in their own archives. Another thing that we're working in Canada is the National Indigenous Fire Working Group. So in Canada, we have many Indigenous, we have many national working groups. So they look at things like aviation, training, I'm trying to remember what else. There's a mitigation and prevention. And so what we thought in Canada was that, you know, as Indigenous nations, we seem to be missing this like united voice in wildfire where we can come forward together and say, you know, this is where we need to go, or these are some standards we should develop, or these are things that are honestly inappropriate that are happening. So the first step was engagement sessions with 46 Indigenous fire experts from across Canada, where we identified key themes and recommendations for the working group. And this picture is actually from last week where the steering committee met for this working group, where we are beginning to develop the terms of reference. So, you know, what will we look at? What will we advocate for in Canada related to wildfire. So yeah, stay tuned for what that group does in the future. Another big movement in Canada has been led through the Indigenous Leadership Initiatives, and that's basically the guardian work in Canada. And one of the things is basically forming fire guardians. And so looking at if there's some sort of way that we can get Indigenous people on the ground in year-round employment in fire in their territories. And so the Indigenous Leadership Initiative developed their national strategy for Indigenous fire guardians. Again, don't worry about the text here, just wanted to show you, and I'll share the PDF and you can zoom in and look at it. But it's just that these are quite complex issues and there's so many barriers in Canada, but communities are really wanting to push forward in this area. Another big initiative that we worked on was the cultural safety of Indigenous wildland firefighters. There's many Indigenous firefighters in Canada. We have what we call type 2 crews in Canada. So those are basically our, mop-up crews, and the majority of them are Indigenous peoples, but they receive very little credit in Canada for the work that they do in fire management. They're kind of, those crews that operate in the background, but are vitally important. And so we wanted to know, and I should also say many of them don't move up or progress in their careers. They basically stay on these what we call lower level type 2 crews for their career. And some have been on these crews 30, 40, 50 years. So we wanted to look at why are people not moving up? What's going on there? What are experiences regarding accident and injury rates? Sickness, chronic illness, close calls, or racism, discrimination, or harassment. And then, what's currently being done by agencies to promote cultural safety. And what was really interesting about this study was that we found that I think it was 97% of the over 100 respondents that we had loved their job. That was the thing that kept coming up. But it also at the same time, over 70% had experienced racism or discrimination or harassment on the fire line. So, in any other workplace, those numbers would be absolutely unacceptable. So what this project is trying to do, we're trying to get the next stage of funding for it, which is to start developing products to promote cultural safety. So Dominique mentioned this is one of our most recent things that's come out is wearefire.ca. And so it's a web page, and on the webpage, it's a toolkit for applying Indigenous-led fire practices and Western fire management in the Saskatchewan River Delta. So that's in northern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba. And I think the really interesting thing about this website is that it was basically started by Renee and Solomon Carrier. And Solomon Carrier is a trapper, a Métis and First Nation trapper in that region who, holds substantial fire knowledge, but cannot use fire on the landscape like he wants, and has just seen massive decline in the animals that he relies on in the Delta and just the overall health of the Delta. So this group kind of came together to work with them to kind of bring their story forward and to look at other ways, that we can go about getting fire on the ground. And it is one of the really interesting sidebar, I don't know what the proper word is, but topics is, understanding the politics of fire. And so if you go and click on that, it brings you to a drop-down menu, and you can basically look at all the policies and legislation in Canada that have disconnected us from the land and from using fire, and then moving forward towards fire reconciliation and what can be done, and then examples for engaging in Indigenous-led fire prescriptions. So check that page out. I think it's a really important piece of work. And yeah, I hope that people can go to it and get some information on, how to actually start returning fire. So I think this is my last slide here. Hopefully I'm still good for time. There's still lots of issues in Canada, right? We hear about this topic and it's just okay, yeah, well, we should just do that. We should just let Indigenous people burn. But there's many, I deal all the time with these barriers that are in play. And so there's low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire in Canada. I constantly hear, that was an old practice that, might have worked 100 years ago, but it doesn't apply on the landscape today. And that's really removing us from like, that our knowledge systems are always growing and always changing. It's not a static thing that, knowledge system that we rely on. And many Indigenous knowledge systems have adapted to, changes on the landscape, colonialism being the biggest one. And so there's no reason why we can't adapt knowledge to the current landscape. And I was going to say too, most of the time when you go with elders to the land to talk about, returning fire, the first thing that they say is that the forest is so unhealthy that we can't just go back and put normal cultural burns on the land. There has to be some intervention done first, which is, a stand replacing prescribed fire or mechanical treatments or hand thinning or something, just because there's too much fuel load right now. So there's also massive power dynamics at play. People don't want to, let go of their control of the landscape. There's lots of fear around Indigenous burning. And one thing that I found that when I started this, I didn't really think of was how this all relates to Indigenous sovereignty and land back. So right now in Canada, nations can burn on their reserves, which are, generally tiny kind of postage stamp things in their like large territories. And that's where they want to burn, is on their larger territory. But if a government says like, okay, you can burn in your territory, then that's basically recognizing formally that that is their territory. So then, it could lead to other court cases and other things about, extending, sovereignty and autonomy to that landscape. So there's a lot of fear there. There's a lot of non-Indigenous interest in appropriation of cultural fire knowledge. And so it's one thing that I'm always talking about on the podcast is that, it's good people are interested and supportive of this work, but there's a very fine line to cross. And so in our work, we're always promoting Indigenous-led cultural burning. That's what we use all the time now. And what I'm seeing with agencies in Canada is that they want to learn about cultural burning. They're recognizing the importance. But usually what they want is for elders to come in and teach them about cultural fires so that they can go and do it themselves. But then they still don't let that elder do it. Whereas, that elder is the one who holds the knowledge. So it's really a strange situation at the moment. There's also no sustained funding for jobs for Indigenous people in this area. So, sometimes we'll get money for a one-off project, a one-off burn, but we can't really create and move forward on this kind of landscape or territory of fire stewardship. And, for me, I think the Fire Guardians program that's emerging is a great place to start, and I'm hoping we can push it. So yeah, to me, it all comes down in the end to social justice. And, Indigenous people, fire was basically taken from us when colonialism happened. And I just think that, if we are serious about returning fire to the landscape, then, it shouldn't be agencies doing it, or agencies can, but obviously in partnership with Indigenous people who were, the initial fire holders on the landscape. So yeah, again, just pointing to conclude to the Good Fire podcast. So there's season 1 and season 2 of the podcast now, hopefully a season 3 soon, which I'm hoping will be the matriarch season, where we just talk to Indigenous women about their fire use. And yeah, I'm just happy mostly to have a discussion and answer any questions that you all have.
Right, let's give our thanks. Hear us okay on the Zoom here?
Yep, I'm back now. I'm out of the screen so I can see you all again.
Well, I took about 4 pages of notes, and you had a very captive audience here, and I'm sure on Zoom. Yeah, I really appreciate, we have such similar history to our neighbors there in the north in terms of colonization. So it's really inspiring to see how folks are navigating those challenges and hearing about those community partnerships and community governance, local and Indigenous governance of that data and of how that work is being done. Just very inspiring. But what we have here is we have our Jamboard. And so there's a couple ways we can navigate this. One thing that I like to do is allow our guests to choose what questions they would like to answer the most to start off our discussion. And you're also most welcome to take questions from folks that might want to share those with you. But for folks who are on Zoom, you're also welcome to click on these sticky notes here to add your questions or use this function here. So yeah, I can turn it over to you if there's anything you want to start with. We do have some students here in the room. If they want to come up and ask a question, you're also welcome to do so.
Sounds good. I'm just zooming in on this so I can read it.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm on a tiny laptop, so it's like, but yeah. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll just, sorry, they're all really good questions, so it's hard to know where to go here, but maybe I'll start with, so what have been the biggest challenges with integrating traditional ecological knowledge into land management practice, and how have you gotten Indigenous representation to be recognized within those, I think, projects it must be? So yeah, I think like I mentioned before, one of the biggest issue that we face is that, you know, government, and so in Canada we have this new with our Liberal government here, this push towards reconciliation, and so a lot of that was related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that came out. And so in that there were multiple recommendations for people for moving forward on reconciliation, and some of those you know, are like involving Indigenous people in land management and things like that. So agencies have started doing that, but for me the biggest issue is that it's never kind of with that Indigenous leadership, like I was talking about before. So they always want us to come in and train their existing folks, but the second it comes to shifting power, it's just almost a no-go, or there's always barriers in the way or different obstacles. And so we have a paper that came out called Right to Burn, and that one I think is a good example of kind of many of the different obstacles that we face in this area. And so another thing that I'm often seeing in Canada is that we always seem to need to have Western science to like back up Indigenous knowledge. And it's actually driving me quite crazy, I'll be honest. So, you know, we'll have elders that'll come and say, you know, like this forest is unhealthy, we need to burn it. And then it's like immediately the academics rush in like, okay, well, what can we set up here? How can we monitor this? How can we do that? And so yeah, for me, when it's Indigenous territory, it's like, why aren't we just listening to our elders on these things, right? And it was funny because I went to this one dialogue thing and an elder went up and just told stories and talked about the landscape, and it was great. And then a Western scientist came up and then did, you know, basically confirmed all his points through Western science. And I was just like, did we really need the second talk? Like, no offense, but it's just, for me, like so that's one thing that I'm really struggling with in Canada is how we get that recognition of our knowledge just on its own. You know, do we always need to have these things? And so burning is like that, right? Like the big thing in Canada too now is this fire effects monitoring. So how do we prove that cultural burning, you know, is working on the landscape and bringing back the plants that we want? And but it's like you can't just, everything has to be formalized, right? Like we can't just say, you know, well, now nations are achieving cultural objectives on the landscape that they weren't able to before. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so anyways, that was a long response to that question.
Oh, that's great. We definitely share in that struggle here in the US, you know, mm-hmm. and here in academia and in the field with practitioners. So I think it's really resonating, I know, for me in this field. And I like to think about those Indigenous knowledge as our first scientists, those elders and community members, as carrying data from, you know, longitudinal studies lasting centuries. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting the way that that data is questioned disproportionately to, you know, other bodies of data in the field. So I really just appreciate that. Yeah, you're welcome to pick another question, or if folks want to unmute, you're welcome to unmute as well.
Yeah, I was just seeing that there's one here that kind of relates. So how do you fight against the pushback from scientists who do not believe that Indigenous knowledge is accurate just because it wasn't taught in academics? And so I'm going to say, like, I don't have a perfect answer. There's racism like all the time in academia, unfortunately. I'm sure y'all have discussed that. In that paper that we wrote, that Centering Indigenous Voices paper, it had two of the most racist reviews I've ever seen on it that came through. And so the reviewers were non-Indigenous, older male academics and so for me, it was like, why are they even reviewing this? They don't have the expertise to review it. But because, it's a fire piece and they're experienced in fire, they're automatically considered as the experts. And so I wanted to, for a while, we thought about withdrawing that paper and just submitting it to an Indigenous journal. But part of me was like, no, we need to fight back, and so that's what we did on that one. And so for me, that's one thing that's hard though, because I have my job and then now I'm taking on all these other fights too. And so one was related to that paper, a reviewer had recommended that I check out this one article. That was an article from the 1930s that was published in the Fire Ecology Journal. So I went and looked at it, and it was so racist towards Indigenous people that I contacted the editors and said, what the heck is this doing in your journal, right? And they were actually really good. They were like, well, we don't know how it made it. And they have a new policy now of reviewing historical reprints. But there was all this work that came from that, right, on myself and other Indigenous colleagues. So I think that that's one thing that's difficult, right? Because at the same time, we just want to do our jobs and, be in our communities. And I want to learn more about my culture and stuff, but it's hard when I'm constantly, having to spend time fighting all these other battles. So that's all I'll say is that it's a struggle, but I think it's important to stand up. And as allies too, I think that it's important as well that you're also in positions of power where you can push back. And so I've heard at one meeting I was at where someone said, well, Indigenous knowledge, yeah, that's fine, but isn't that all just myths and legends? And so, that's a good place where an ally can step in and say, take the burden off of us and say, wait, no, that's not correct. And here's how you're wrong and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. I'm really grateful that you shared that story. You didn't have to share that story, but it's important that it's heard because that experience is not, unfortunately, not too unique with the review process. I've experienced it. A lot of my colleagues have experienced it. It's kind of that unspoken, unseen labor that goes into actually getting this work into this body of academic literature. Just so many barriers and biases and such unscientific responses at times too. As a scientist, I struggle with the way biases are accepted and almost have to put quotes around that peer review and questioning what that means. With seeing what goes through sometimes too by non-Indigenous authorship and the way it's been filtered and sometimes really misrepresented as well, that is in the body of work. So I just want to say I'm glad that you told that story.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just gonna say too that part of the reason why in my earlier writing I use traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge a lot, but I've actually stopped using it. I've kind of tried to remove it from my vocabulary because what I'm finding working in government is that the second you use the word traditional, that's just an excuse for not doing it. And so I find that now if we use the term Indigenous knowledge, that just places it as living kind of more current knowledge. So yeah, anyways, just an aside there.
Yeah, appreciate it. We do have a question. Do you mind coming up? And okay, we have a student who joined us as a guest.
Okay. Hello, my name is Bobby. My question was just what Indigenous residencies in Canada look like now, just because you've said beforehand that you guys were relocated at some point in history. Did you guys ever move back, or were you guys able to make a deal with the government, I guess, and move somewhere else where you guys have more of a connection to nature there, or did you guys have to stay where you guys got relocated?
Yeah, so I think that I would say the vast majority have stayed where they are relocated, the reserves, and that's just because of how formal the process of the reserve boundaries was and putting people there. And their housing too, it's similar to the States where then housing and services are potentially supposed to be provided, but many are so derelict and stuff. It's just terrible. But there have been new deals that have been put into place, you know, like with Parks Canada, for example. We're co-managing now quite a few different national parks with different nations. And so, and there is some where there's agreements, you know, to do more territorial management. But in Canada, it's really interesting because it's still like there I saw maps, I think when I was in Oregon and Washington, of just how divided up the land is everywhere between like private, public ownership, forest companies, all this. But in Canada, it's really not. It's most of our land in Canada is called what we call crown land, which is just the vast proportion of the Canadian landscape. And so crown land does not go back to Indigenous nations at the moment. And I think that's what Indigenous people are fighting for, is to have that some of that territory returned.
So is it more to like, not exactly to like actually hold residency and like live there and like have your home there, but more of like having control of that area of like for the like fires, for example?
Yeah, so I think like for people from their nation, like, you know, some live, we call it like kind of on reserve or off reserve where they live. But even then, like they can't technically like manage that land to the way that they want either. There's a lot of jurisdictional limits and other things. So yeah, when we have like, for example, if you wanted to go on your reserve and start a fire, and then someone, you know, from the neighboring jurisdiction reported you, then, you know, they would come and try to put your fire out and stuff. So there's, still a lot of gray area in there. In terms of the territories that nations are trying to access at the moment, most aren't able to do any sort of like land management in those territories, you know, where it's actually making changes. Some have hunting rights and other things, but in terms of like going and starting a fire, like no, you would be charged.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I could mention too, since this is a teaching moment, one thing up here is the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and thinking about those inherent rights and responsibilities and how self-determination, you know, those governing rights allow people to uphold those responsibilities, like you mentioned, inherent responsibilities to fire. And so I'm curious too, is UNDRIP something that's informing any of that work and some of that policy movement and shift, in addition to I know it's part of the Truth and Reconciliation Act, like it's in communication, but I'm just curious if that's showing up at all in your region, and so, like how it is in BC, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's lots of like from Indigenous Nations for UNDRIP. Like actually I had a slide on that at some point. I must have deleted it off there, but so it's so for us, like, you know, when we're putting in for funding or, you know, arguing about the right to burn, one thing we always refer to is UNDRIP and then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. But what's happening right now is that the Canadian government, the federal government is supportive, some provincial governments are supportive, but no one's really willing to just adopt, you know, it verbatim. And so there's lots of stuff that goes back and forth. And there's a huge thing about, you know, that right to veto or like consent to projects and what does consent mean and what's that right to veto. And so basically there is legislation coming, but lots of it is kind of being rewritten to, you know, so that nations basically can't veto, you know, important resource extraction projects if the Canadian government, you know, determines that they're important.
We have another one. Come on up. Oh, 11:40. We have our timekeeper, so we have 5 minutes remaining. We definitely still have time for more questions. Wanted to wonder if anyone wants to unmute or come up, including those folks joining remotely. You're welcome to unmute.
I can answer one here. So it's kind of two that are, so can you talk about a particularly impactful moment or project in your career and how it has influenced your work? And then the other one is, how do you stay motivated in your work, particularly when faced with obstacles? And so for me, the real important thing is like the community grounding. So being able to go out and see people and, you know, learn from elders and be on the land. And that was one thing that was really difficult during COVID, was, you know, that disconnection, and for good reason, right? Like trying to protect our elders there. But for me, that was a hard period of time with work, because it just kept seeming like it was just barrier after barrier. And I find, like, when you go out on the land and, like, you know, use fire, talk about fire, it's just like things just get much more simple. And I think sometimes I've heard criticism of, you know, the use of the term good fire, bad fire, because it really presents like a simple dichotomy of the terms. And I just want to say too that that's like, obviously fire is much more complex. We know that lightning driven bad fires in the summer can have good effects right on the landscape, but it's just this whole idea of trying to kind of, in Canada, like most of the Canadian public thinks of every fire here as a bad fire or something that's dangerous and is going to hurt them. And so it's really trying, it's more of like, I think, a term for education, not as much like a scientific academic term there. And so for me, like, I really just love getting out with the elders. And so for one, that like impactful thing was when we went and did some sage burning with one of the fire keepers in British Columbia. And then, you know, afterwards we just went out after, just him and I and another woman, and just went and picked sage like in another area, and just saw, like, you know, a healthy landscape and what that could produce. So it's like moments like that to me that are, yeah, have been super important and fulfilling. And then too, I should say too, we had our first Métis cultural fire camp at Rocky Mountain House, where I'm from. And so my daughter came to that. So it was a youth fire camp. And so that was like really fulfilling. It was actually on our a day where here we have like to recognize like the Truth and Reconciliation and what happened with residential schools. It's a national holiday in Canada. And I had gone to a ceremony that morning, and it was raining and just sad. And then I got out to the culture camp, and it was like the sun came out and kids were running around everywhere, and I had to do opening remarks, and I literally just started bawling because I was like, for me, it was just like hearing what all these elders had gone through, and then seeing like that for our youth and our children, like it's not going to be the same in Canada, and that there's real pride in our work, and, you know, people want to fight for these cultural values and practices.
Sounds like good medicine and really the healing quality. Those great, like all those generations, you know, resident schools and also the youth. So yeah, really grateful to hear those stories. I think we have time for one more question. We've got one here. Do you want to come up? Okay. This is crash the class today, so
Well, thank you.
yeah, come on up so that.
Thank you. My name is Harry. I teach here
Yeah.
at Short Range, but hit upon some really good points. Elder knowledge and knowing the appropriate time to fire back on the land. Two is oh sure, I'm sorry. Two is employment and taking that knowledge and getting not firefighters, but fire use back on the left. Had a fire here on fire, the only crew that could show up was reservation in South Dakota, and they had knowledge and they had experience, and they were able to, and they had an economic reason to be there as well. We're starting in March, and we're going to have a money that we can generate come back to our community. So I think the elderly knowledge definitely, but also the economic. And you talked about that year round, because you know any climate change we can turn year round. So, but thank you for your work. Thank you for letting me say something.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the whole idea.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say with the year-round work too, like an important part of that is education, environmental monitoring, like looking at species at risk, doing, you know, education with children, planning cultural burning. Like there's all sorts of things that can be done in a year. But right now in Canada, we don't have that at the moment, but we're really pushing, and there is funding now to develop these. So yeah, stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be starting. And I should say too, the idea is based on, in Australia, the fire ranger programs in the Northern Territory. So, you know, those were the initial, I think, fire guardians.
Yeah, wonderful. And working across our community. It's good to see educators here. So thank you for joining us. Dr. Cardinal Christianson has agreed to record this. So I hope you share it with your friends and colleagues in our communities. As you can see, there's so much we have to learn. There are so many great resources available to us to really carry this important work in land and fire stewardship forward. So I know having young kids, how precious your time and energy is. So I want to just say a home thank you to you for taking time from this important work and from your family to teach us and to join our classroom today. And yeah, just thank you for coming, and we'll continue to share out what we've learned here, definitely. So we're at our time. If folks, you know, just say Amy one more time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Great questions. And yeah, happy to discuss more in the future. So thanks, Dominique. We'll catch up.
All right, sounds good. You take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.